thank you, everyone. This is the second State of the Commonwealth Q&A. So we've covered we've now had two videos. We've covered quite a lot of topics. Back with us are Natalie and Bob, who we met from the last video. Now we have a couple of attendees. We've got a few new attendees coming in. That's great. Do we have any questions? Otherwise, we will just kick off with some area, because there are always lots of interesting areas to talk about. So the aim here is to talk about Australia, feminism, anti-feminism, misandry, androphobia, as Bob points out, which is a distinct concept. And I've added that to Wiki for Men actually more recently. So, any questions? Otherwise, we'll pick something to go with. Natalie, do you have any thoughts on an area we might start today? I know I'm putting you on the spot there a little bit.
Sorry, I have, would you like me to record as well?
Oh, yes. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
You need to grant me permission.
Oh, yep. Right.
Carl set his alarm for 5 p.m. and slept through it until 9 p.m.
There we go. Okay. So, Natalie, do you have any thoughts on particular areas you'd like to talk about? Otherwise? Yeah.
It's like we've sort of touched base on a lot of things. I think people are sick of my voice.
No.
Any thoughts?
There's no evidence for that.
Otherwise, I've got one.
No, bring it up and we can discuss it.
Oh, okay. All right. So now, bearing in mind that we are about to propose we talk about a living, breathing person, we must always be mindful of the things we say. Clementine Ford. Clementine Ford is a well-known Australian feminist. She has I think it would be fair to say, a history of making vitriolic comments about men, including kill all men. And she at one point said COVID-19 wasn't killing enough men, for example. I think that would be objectively a vitriolic comment. So, but what's interesting about all this, I see that Natalie's sort of had to lock her lips at the moment. What's interesting about all this is Clementine Ford, within the last couple of weeks, has come out and said she's abandoning hate and she is going for love. So, does anyone on any attendees have any questions about this? Or
I'll have a comment.
Great, Bob, go ahead.
This makes me recall a classic quote from former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, in that an Iranian moderate is one who's run out of ammunition. So this radical feminist moderate is one who's run out of money.
Yep. So very good point. Actually, Clementine nearly lost a small scholarship granted by the Victorian state government over some of her comments about, I think it might have been the one about COVID-19 not killing enough men. So, but she didn't. They gave her a bit of a warning over that. But it's interesting now, there was another incident where we've seen another feminist actually sort of take a step back as well. And I kind of think that maybe we're seeing a little bit of a change. The wind is changing direction a little bit. They've sensed this and they realised that these sort of comments that they've been making over the last 10, 15 years aren't going to fly anymore. Natalie.
Okay, so, we've got a comment in the chat.
Yeah.
From Jonathan Lalis. Sorry if I mispronounced that. I believe that Clementine Ford's own admission, she has serious mental health issues. No shit, Sherlock. Okay. When it comes to Clementine Ford and Cheryl Moody, these two specific, I've got no filter. So, excuse me from here on in. Clementine Ford saying that she's got mental health issues is not a get out of jail free card. And I'm going to, women seem to give women a get out of jail free card when it comes to abuse, where they've killed the children, where verbal abuse, her stupid tweets. I can't say the F word, I know that. She puts out these vile comments that if a guy did it, he would be history. He wouldn't have a job. In fact, she's gotten men fired.
She has.
For their words on her Twitter account for something she said. So she threw the grenade, it got fired back, and she cried when she got hit by the shrapnel.
Mm-hmm.
She is to turn around and then say, oh, okay, so all this hatred isn't working for my narrative. I'm going to now say it's all full up. She's still going to be vile. She's still going to be disgusting. And I cannot forgive her for the things that she said. I mean, we've got to stop giving women a get out of jail free card by pulling the mental health card, because it just doesn't work like that.
I absolutely agree. And I've got probably a couple of comments, but it's interesting you talk about forgiveness there, Natalie. One of the other Natalie was in this Q&A as well. We had a Q&A with Yoav Levine, an Israeli gentleman who I've known for a number of years. And he actually said something interesting, and I hadn't heard him say it before, actually. He said that not to worry about forgiveness, but to let go. And I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at it, because at a personal level, I think even if feminism is one day defeated, I think I'll have a lot of trouble really forgiving feminists over the damage they've done to society. And I think letting go is a much better way of looking at it. And that's something I'll be internalizing going forward. I was just going to say, Bob, did you have any thoughts on any comments?
Only in the sense that in the legal system, when you claim diminished responsibility, it's usually only if you can prove your illness made you unable to distinguish between right and wrong. And that is definitely not the case with Clementine Ford.
Yep. That's kind of a similar line that I was about to take too, where the term mental illness is very, very broad. It includes everything from depression, which affects a significant proportion of the population, at least in terms of mild depression, all the way through to psychosis, where a person can't distinguish reality. So if somebody's suffering from a psychosis and they're not responsible for their actions, I'm honestly going to give them a lot more of a pass than I am in some other aspects. So, and I understand that even people with depression have distorted reality, and so all the view of reality can be distorted. But nevertheless, I am concerned that there is a problem where it's sort of being used to, give a pass to certain subsets of the community. I
just have to say, I actually have to admit, I'm unfamiliar with anything that Clementine Ford has said about her own mental illnesses.
I agree. I hadn't heard that.
I'm not familiar, and I don't know if she's claiming to have any sort of, she's making claims that any of the things, the positions she has are connected to those things. So
yeah, no, I agree.
I have to admit that since I do not know, I'm unfamiliar, it would not be appropriate for me to make a judgment.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. I haven't heard her say that, or I haven't read, but I must admit I don't pay that much attention to Clementine Ford as a general rule. But I haven't.
I'll be fair. I'll be fair because I don't know. I will not, draw a conclusion based on that.
No, as JL has followed up. So you say, indeed, irrespective of whatever mental health issues she's suffering from, she is still responsible for her statements, absolutely. And to take a look at her Twitter account, apparently she said something there.
Doing now.
Okay, no worries at all. Now, we also have a comment from Carl. Does Clementine Ford know anything about love other than loving herself in a narcissistic way? So I might leave that right there. And Sean has a comment. Australian men were once held up as a global symbol of manliness. I'm thinking of Paul Hogan. Today, Australian feminists seem to be world leaders in hate. When and how did the transformation happen? That is a really great question, actually. Bob, do you want to have a go?
Yes, I think I know when it started.
Okay.
I remember in the early 90s, I started hearing this term, sensitive new age guy. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the clear line where Crocodile Dee, Paul Hogan were no longer the pop culture representation of the Australian male. And I remember them talking about, I was still pretty young, but they're talking about men who cry about international conflicts, children being killed in wars, just men who have characteristics that have been traditionally portrayed as feminine being a desirable thing. So that just would be the earliest reference where I remember there being a change or something else being promoted as being better than what existed beforehand.
So you're thinking sometime in the 90s, really? You think that's
what the first sign? Yes, yes. And also I know like now, like just men used to not. Now it's common for men to wear moisturising cream, for instance. In the 80s, this would not have been the case. If men were, expect to be rugged, and if you were a man and said you put on moisturising cream, they would have said maybe you must be a homosexual. So I really think that we've seen that sort of change. Whether there were other things over the years, I'm interested to hear your thoughts about that, but that's just the very earliest time where I thought of that tough Aussie guy being challenged and something else very different being put in its place as being something that Aussie should aspire to.
Yep.
And I'm interested to hear what the rest of you guys think.
Natalie, got any thoughts on when that might have started?
Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. I was trying to find this tweet, but I can't find anything where.
When did the change happen?
She's got mental health.
When did the change happen for Australian men? When did men used to be the archetype was the manly Australian? And it's
okay. So I did hear when you said, the sensitive new age guy from the 90s. There was also one. I see you next Tuesday. That word, but it was caring, understanding 90s type. I think in the 80s, men were still allowed to be men. I don't think anything necessarily happened in the 80s other than pop culture when it came to men facing a little bit more of their femininity. Like you think of Culture Club and Joy Division and all those new wave type music where there was more hairspray in the guys' hair than there was in the girls, and they wore eyeliner and all that. I don't think that took away their masculinity. I do think somewhere between the 90s and then my son was born, so I wasn't part of the world. I was a mother of a young child. Somewhere in the 2000s, it changed where there was TV shows like Melrose Place and all those types of things where the guys weren't the James Dean and the Marlon Brandos. They were
metrosexuals.
Yeah, and I think somewhere it just got progressively worse. And I think it's not that men forgot how to be men, but there was nothing represented for them. You weren't seeing it in pop culture. You weren't seeing it on the TV shows, the movies. You were seeing these metrosexuals.
So for myself, I tend to agree. I would peg it at somewhere around. I imagine it was probably a process that had been developing for a long time. In fact, there's it's probably a little bit off topic, but there's a gentleman by the name of Ernest Belford Bax, who was a men's rights activist in the early 20th century, in fact, late 19th century, actually. And you could read his stuff and you would think that he'd written it within the last 20 years. So there are certainly aspects that are probably going back a long way, but in terms of that change in what the expectations that men have of themselves, I tend to peg it around there as well, sometime maybe early 90s. I went to university in the early 90s, and the women's room was a hotbed of radical feminism. And what I remember of the women's room is now what we have everywhere in society. So I saw it then. I didn't yet see it as dangerous as it was. I now realise it to be, but it certainly existed. The type of ideology and the type of rhetoric they used was exactly the same thing virtually. A little bit, terminology is a little bit different, but it was very close. And yes, I think that's probably right. It was probably sometime in the 90s, but it has been a gradual process.
Yeah, I think it's always, takes time.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a gradual shift.
So, so Sean makes a really good point. Actually, he says, strikes me Paul Hogan's world was a rural one. Today's feminist world is a very, very suburban one, and that's actually a really good point. So, for those, I don't know, we've got a few attendees. I'm not sure how many are from overseas. The Australian archetype is really a rural one in many ways, or the traditional view, but in actual fact, we're very much an urban dwelling culture. The vast majority of Australians live in cities. In fact, the vast majority of Australians live in sort of 6 or 7 cities that are either at or near the state capital. So we have a small proportion of the population who live rurally. Have the men who are rural in Australia have a very, very high suicide rate, significantly much higher than the suburban men. In fact, I went to a red pill screening in Gladstone. It's a shame Adrian Pearce can't be here. He was in the Q&A, but unfortunately he wasn't able to make it. Sorry, he was in the video. He wasn't able to make it to the Q&A tonight. But I was invited up there to speak on a panel after they'd had a screening. And the only topic that concerned the people there was suicide. And that was really eye-opening. As a city dweller myself, it was really eye-opening. I knew the stats and everything, but to go there and actually talk to the rural community, and that's what really concerned them. So, and I could totally understand. I went away from that. I mean, I went there, I was a panelist, and I went away understanding, I think, a little bit better where they were coming from. So it's a huge problem in our rural community. And but the rural community is only a relatively small portion of the population. We have all sorts of systems to try to divert money towards the rural areas, but it's never enough. So Alistair Michael Gaffner says, not being from Australia, how do the Australian men's sheds contribute or not to helping men get out or getting on with their issues? That's a really great question. Bob, do you want to have a go at that?
I'm not really familiar. My perception of the men's sheds is that they're small and insignificant. It's good that they exist, but I don't think they change a great deal given
that's
how
nice.
few there are.
Natalie?
But if you know more, go. Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
Okay, so I was, up until recently, just for 1 year, I was part of a community house. And this community house dealt with the men's shed. Now, anybody from Australia knows about the famous sausage sizzle at Bunnings. And there's men's sheds that do this sausage sizzle, the $2 sausage sizzle at Bunnings. And my understanding, it's not just about them getting together and talking about their issues or their feelings in a safe space. It's also so they can give back to the community, so they can get back to their hands, and they build stuff for the community. They, it's about them. How can I don't mean this in a derogatory way towards anyone. It's about them getting back to the caveman primal thing where it's just them working with the hands and building stuff and talking like blokes. And it's okay to talk like blokes.
Yes.
I mean, the things girls say behind closed doors would give you guys a run for your money.
Several women have told me that through my life, actually. Yes, about the things that get spoken about when it's just women. Absolutely.
So there's nothing that I've heard from the blokes talk of I being, oh my God, that's so disgusting and so sexist, considering I also have heard some of the crap that comes out of women's mouth. And I'm like, are you kidding me?
So to clarify for anybody who's wondering if you're not from Australia, wondering what a sausage sizzle is. So okay, barbecues are an Australian tradition, and usually there are lots of different groups that do it to raise money. Some large business will let the group, usually a non-profit or something, some large business will let this non-profit set up a bunch of stalls in their car park, and they sell cheap sausages. Now, I've had sausages all over the world. I love German sausages, and Oktoberfest is actually really big here because we actually had a lot of Germans come here in the 19th century and so forth. And I really don't like Australian sausages, but they sell them they're a couple of bucks for Australians. They're cheap. I don't like them, but people love it. They go up and they get their cheap sausages, and the club, whether it's a men's shed or something else, will make some money. So. Yes, and Carl's just saying, yes, before I get on to answering that, Alan's question, but Carl said, yeah, so you mean not all Aussie men are not like Steve Irwin? No, we like to think we are, though, but that's not how it works. So speaking for myself, I lived overseas for a number of years. I don't play cricket. I think I barely understand the rules. I don't drink beer. What's other in Australia? What's another Australian cliche? But anyway, if you think of an Australian, what's that? Sorry, Bob?
Vegemite sandwiches. Do you eat?
Yeah, I don't particularly like Vegemite, actually. So I joked for years that I was in exile because I pretty much don't fit any male Australian cliche. Anyway, getting back to the men's shed. So a lot of the men who attend men's sheds really speak highly of them. There are a lot of them around in different towns. They probably are quite small in a lot of cases, but there are a lot of them around. Bettina Arndt's actually done some videos on this, and if you're particularly interested, you should be able to find those on her channel. Or if you had trouble, ask us and we could give you a hand finding them. Bettina's spoken at ICMI too this year and in previous years. The men's sheds are and Natalie hit the nail on the head, if you'll excuse the pun, when she said they could be blokey. Okay, sorry, a blokey in Australian English means to be manly, right? Or to be. So the problem is that in most men's sheds in Australia are now admitting women, and it has modified the language in the men's sheds. I've never been to a men's shed, but this is what we're hearing from Bettina, who's looked into it thoroughly, and many men. Now, my view on single-sex spaces is both or neither. I personally don't have any particular interest in them, but if society is going to have but one, it should have the other. So if there are women's-only gyms, then there should be men's sheds or whatever it happens to be. The problem we're seeing is that in Australia particularly, it may be true elsewhere as well, but there have traditionally been men's clubs and women's clubs in Australia, and the men's clubs have come under attack, which probably won't be a surprise to anybody here, I don't think. But almost all of the men's clubs in Australia are now admitting women. Almost no Australians know that there are also women's clubs that are at least as exclusive as the men's clubs. So in Brisbane, the capital of Queensland where I live, there's a very famous club called Tattersalls. Tattersalls recently accepted men. It was one of the last major men's clubs in Australia to do so. And I'll name them.
They accepted women? Sorry.
They accepted women. Yeah. Sorry, did I say?
Yeah, men. Yeah.
Sorry. So it's a men's club. It accepted women. Thank you. There's another club that hardly anybody knows about in Brisbane called the Morton Club. I've got a page for them on Wiki for Men. It's a very exclusive women's only club, far more exclusive than Tattersalls has ever been. And not only don't they accept men, there's never been any effort to actually get men in there. So nobody has tried to get men in there, and they're quite happy to remain a single-sex organisation. And this is the whole problem we're seeing. And so the men's sheds, the argument is it was a place men could go to be with men, and young men could learn skills from older men. And what I'm hearing is that's breaking down.
Why? There's a nightclub in Melbourne. I know for a fact there's a nightclub in Melbourne that only allows gay men. Rightly so.
I have heard of that, actually. Yep, go on.
100% rightly so, 100% support it. No women are trying to get into this men-only gay club, but women are trying to get into straight, cisgender male clubs. Why?
Well, they perceive them, they believe that there's this old boys network, I think, and they...
Yes.
What's it, sorry?
Yes, the Australian Club was the major one that was in the news, where they had a vote and they voted to retain the men-only status, and a few members resigned.
Yeah.
But that was the reason, that they thought that these were elite places where people could advance their careers and gain power, and so women should have access to them.
I really question, particularly in Australia, whether that was ever really true.
I think it was. I think it was, but to me, these things are living fossils.
Do you know
We're
something?
in a very different society now.
Yeah, exactly. But maybe it was true once. But I mean, I'm nearly 50, and I went to one of Queensland's elite private schools. Okay, now I got good grades, right? But going to one of Queensland's elite private schools has never helped me in any way. If there's an old boys network in Queensland, they've kept me out of it. And if anybody's going to be in it, it'll be the guys who are from my school. And I've never even seen it.
Did you learn the secret handshake?
They must have done that the day I was away.
I just don't. Why men's sheds? It's men's sheds. It's in the title. Women, F off. Let them be blokes.
As I said, to me, it's both or neither. That's my view. So, no, those are some really good questions, actually. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We've got a little bit more time. Good. All right. Let's see. I'm just looking through some of the issues we've got here. We've talked about the Workplace Gender Equality Agency in a previous video.
I just, on the topic of these elite clubs, I mean, really, Australia has historically tried to see itself as a classless society. There's always been this anti-elite thing going. And to me, if you really believe that this club has power, the only women who are going to have access to this club are elite women.
Mm.
So to me, that's just creating a new form of discrimination against non-elite women, and so on. So I don't think this rights any real wrong. If indeed this club is a place where people can have access to exclusive contacts that can advance them in their wealth and career.
Mm. Yeah,
it's just so like.
And the reality is, it would only be wealthy. These clubs are still quite expensive. I mean, the membership,
very expensive.
Yeah, the membership for, I think, Tattersall is something like 1,500 Australian dollars a year just to have a basic membership, and that's more than a lot of people are prepared to spend. So even if it was a place to gain access to the halls of power, it's only elite women who are going to manage to do it.
Yeah, just that other people who told me who've been in these clubs said they're just full of geezers.
Right. Yes.
Probably talking about the glory days of yesteryear. So
yeah, exactly. That's right.
I can have a better time. I can have a better time with that money with my mates.
Yeah. So if we want to move on, we have many feminist organisations in Australia, and I don't think this is something we really touched on. We did briefly speak about it, I think, but we have Our Watch, we have White Ribbon Australia. Now, there are other White Ribbon organisations in the world, but I think White Ribbon Australia is probably one of the most active. White Ribbon Australia actually went bankrupt a couple of years ago, but the branding and all the intellectual property has been purchased by another organisation, and they're trying to resurrect it. But White Ribbon Australia actually was attacked even by feminists at one stage. So I don't know, Bob or Natalie, do you have any thoughts on the lovely feminist organisations we have in Australia?
Yes. Well, I call them androphobic hate groups.
Mm.
That's how I refer to White Ribbon Australia and ANROS and Our Watch.
Mm.
That I don't think they actually do anything to help women in trouble. They just go around trying to make young men feel guilty, scapegoat men collectively for the crimes done, the things, inappropriate actions done by a minority, and they're not a random minority. And they tell women that we live in a misogynist hellhole. This country is a misogynist hellhole. And overall, I believe it's been shown that this is the safest country in the world to be a woman.
Yes, I think possibly with the exception of Japan and South Korea, that I think that is correct, yes.
So these things, they get government money to spread hate and not actually help someone in trouble. So
that's right.
They shouldn't even exist in my point of view. And it's just surprising. We've had stories about the male members of these groups have turned out to be committed violent assaults against women, hiding in plain sight pretending themselves to be heroes, champions of the female cause. when they are the very people that women should be aware of. And
yes, exactly.
It seems that the best way for a bad man to avoid accountability is pretend to be a feminist and join these, pile hate on other men.
There do seem to have been an inordinate number of male feminists that have been found guilty of various offences against women in recent years. So I haven't got any hard data on that, but just anecdotally or qualitatively, it does seem to be the case.
I think also put some clarification on white fibbing is they are also the see you in the Northern Territory people who sued Erin Pritzi for the title.
Yes, actually, that's a really good point. Before we go on to that, I just want to make one point about White Ribbon Australia. Now, actually, you'll notice I always say White Ribbon Australia, and that actually comes out from what happened with Erin. So, okay. So first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about their business model. This was the old business model before they went under. I don't know exactly what they're going to be doing in the new incarnation, but basically an organisation would hold a lunch or something along those lines, an anti-domestic violence lunch, and they would use White Ribbon Australia paraphernalia and branding, and they would raise awareness. And then they would pay a significant proportion of the money effectively in licensing fees to White Ribbon Australia. And it was something like 95%. If you look on A Voice for Men, there is actually, Voice for Men many years ago did a deep dive into the finances of White Ribbon Australia, and you can see the expenses there and how all that happens. Very, very little money that White Ribbon Australia essentially takes in goes towards helping anyone, not even women, who are victims of domestic or intimate partner violence.
Just to get the word, it's White Ribbon Australia just likes to get paid money to put the fear into women that men are the enemy.
Yeah. So some years ago, Erin, I'll be clear exactly what happened. At one point, A Voice for Men actually registered a White Ribbon domain, and it was quite a well-known White Ribbon domain, and in fairly short order, transferred it to the ownership, the custody effectively of Erin Pitsey. Now, Erin's been talked about in a number of presentations here at ICMI, but for those who don't know, she invented the domestic violence shelter. She founded a shelter for women and then tried to found a shelter for men and found herself attacked by feminists. It's notable that she has, whereas Refuge, which is the organisation in the UK that she founded decades ago, doesn't even mention her in their website. I remember when Erin mentioned that. In contrast, she has presented at many ICMIs and knows many people involved here. I've spoken to Erin on the phone a number of times, talked to her a lot over the years, had the pleasure of meeting her when I went to London. So Erin's been involved in our movement for a long time, which I think should show where our views lie and where the feminist views lie. But anyway, the domain was transferred to Erin in fairly short order, and it was realised that that was the appropriate place for it to be. Then White Ribbon Australia actually took Erin through an arbitration process over ownership of the domain or control of the domain, and it was transferred off Erin to White Ribbon Australia, and that happened 5, 6, 7 years ago, I guess, somewhere around there. So anyway, but it's throughout this, I've always been very careful to say White Ribbon Australia to make it clear that because they're the ones who are doing that, there are actually other White Ribbon organisations in the world. But White Ribbon Australia, at least while it was around, seems to have been the most successful for a while. But then it really tanked. But unfortunately, now it's back.
Yeah, Nathan Fillion. I think places like White Ribbon and Our Watch and a couple of others that I won't name, they all have this pretense of trying to help. but they help nobody.
Mm.
It's the fear mongering.
Yeah.
I am safer with 100 men than I am with 100 women.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
And I know that for a fact. And I mean physically safer. Not that a man's going to come and attack me with 100 women. I'm talking about 100 women mad enough that I'm going to go nuts and bitch slap them.
In actual fact, if you were attacked, it will be the men who will come and actually intervene to protect you. Yep. Whether it's innate or whether it's a learned behaviour, or as I suspect, a combination of the two, for whatever reason, men will try to protect women in our society. And in fact, in every society you see this.
We've got to remember that the heroes of this world don't wear capes.
Mm.
And women are heroes with their power and passion, and words and literature and all that sort of stuff. I support a lot of women that have helped a lot of people through the power of the words. Men, 9 times out of 10, are heroes physically. The police, the firemen, the military, the ambos, first responders, the doctors, a majority of females doctors, a majority of females are nurses. I salute them all. These are heroes. But we've got to remember that a majority of them are men.
So we brought up doctors in the previous Q&A, and there was a point I was going to make then, and actually didn't get around to making it, so probably now's a good time. It's actually really interesting to look at what happens after people graduate. So men are more likely to work full time, but they're also more likely to work longer number of years. And I remember, I think it was Harvard or something. I think it was Harvard where there was a study. They assessed their own graduates, and they found that male graduates were working on average 50 years and female graduates 15. And it is really, really interesting actually to look at this, that among doctors, men are significantly more likely to go on to specialise while women remain GPs, okay? But you also see a higher proportion of women going part-time. And as I've said before, work-life balance is very, very important, but nevertheless, this does have an impact on availability. So when they're putting a certain number of people through medical school, I do hope that they are keeping an eye on on what the likely expectation is and how long these people are going to be working, because the shift towards a large number of female doctors means we will have more doctors going part-time and retiring earlier.
I think we said it all before that, I've compared it to our sort of lives, is I work full time, I do this, and I do crafty things on the side. The crafty things are my mental health getaway. Like I just zone out and concentrate on what I'm making. I don't necessarily want to pursue to go any further in my job. We discussed this yesterday, where a male, the men I work with want to keep on chasing who they're going to be in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
And they're who they're going to be is financial, higher up in the company, not because of any egotistical reason, but because it's been embedded into them that's what you've got to constantly be chasing. Where me, I'm happy, I'm content, I don't need to move any further, I've got everything I want, I've raised my son, the only person I have to look after now is myself. So the person I'm going to be in 10 years' time, that I'm chasing that person, not the prospect. I want to be a better person in 10 years' time. I want to be more relaxed in 10 years' time. I don't need more money in 10 years' time. I don't need more this in 10 years' time. I need to be a better person in 10 years' time and healthier.
I think a lot of men are thinking about their ability to bring home the money for their family and make sure their family's got security in 5 or 10 years. So moving on, we've recently had, we've had two, so we've talked about this previously in this series. We've had two states, one's already passed affirmative consent laws, another is about to. So New South Wales, where Bob lives, has already passed affirmative consent laws. Natalie lives in Victoria, which is going to. My state hasn't even brought it up, Queensland. And I certainly hope doesn't. But Queensland tends to be a little bit more conservative. But in the Australian Capital Territory, for those who don't know, is basically a copy of Washington, DC. We took the US Constitution and we actually took large parts out of it and used it for the Australian Constitution. And one of them is we created a territory for the capital. So the Australian Capital Territory has recently had a man who was arrested. Now, this gentleman may have been itinerant. Now, but bear in mind, this is a matter that's currently before the courts. But he's been arrested and charged with rape of a woman he met in a park. Well, actually, there seems to be some confusion about where they met. Some articles claim a park. There seems to have been a party or something involved too. But in any case, the matter seems to have come down to consent. So it will be interesting to see if this is. Now, I don't know if the ACT has followed New South Wales in passing these laws, but it did look like they were looking at the charges against him seemed to be largely on the basis of a question of consent in relation to her capacity to consent as someone who was inebriated. And I think it will be interesting to see, unfortunately, and when I say interesting, it's pretty horrible for everyone involved, but from a legal point of view, I think this might turn out to be some sort of test case. And we also have Brittany Higgins in Australia as a young woman who I think this did hit the international media. Again, we always be mindful of the fact that this is a matter before the courts and so forth. But Brittany Higgins was an employee of the Commonwealth government. She actually worked in Parliament House. She went with a male staffer after hours, which was at a time she shouldn't have been in Parliament House. It was a breach of the rules. He was terminated. His employment was terminated as soon as this became knowledge. She was apparently on the way to having her employment terminated. She's asserted that the young man has raped her. That was a couple of years ago, several years ago. She has not made a formal complaint of rape to the police until recently. So there is, as far as I know, I don't think there could be any physical evidence because I don't think a rape kit would have been done or anything. So I don't even know if there's any physical evidence that they had intercourse. Anyway, he has recently been charged with rape or with sexual assault offence, and is being put before the courts. So I'm, as a layman, I'm surprised. In order to secure a conviction, one needs to find beyond a reasonable doubt. But there's a second standard that has to be met, and that is that there has to be a reasonable prospect of conviction in order to even prosecute. And the prosecution is supposed to look at this and see if there's a reasonable prospect of conviction. I admit, as a layman, it seems to me that without physical evidence and without an admission, I would have thought it would be hard to say that you'd be able to get a reasonable doubt, let alone or even a reasonable prospect of conviction. But this is coming before the courts now, and I think we might be looking at a test case too to see whether there are changes in the way our legal system looks at rape and sexual assault.
Yes, I've been following this case very closely and I feel the same way about it. My understanding is that the accused defence is that they did not have sex. It's as simple as that.
Right. So it's up to the prosecution to prove that they did, and without physical evidence, that would seem to be quite and without an admission, that would seem to be quite a hurdle. And to be clear, the media reports say there were no witnesses. So no admissions, no witnesses, no physical evidence. That would seem to be the prosecution would seem, in my view, to have set themselves a fairly high bar to try to leap over.
I'm very, very angry about how the mainstream media handled this case. Just, you want to say something, Natalie?
Well, I was going to say, I'm not necessarily angry at the media. I'm angry at Brittany Higgins herself. And I'm not saying it did or didn't happen. That's for a court to decide. What I don't like what she did is play the media. she went to the media before going to the police. And we're talking about days.
Yes.
We're not talking about she went to the media at 7 a.m. and then went to the police at 8 a.m. We're talking about days later, she went to the police.
Yes.
She played the Australian media so she could get that sympathy, whether it happened or not. And I'm not saying it's irrelevant to go, you know, if a woman goes if a woman goes through this, it's irrelevant. I'm not saying that. But how she went about it, to me, it's not that it puts doubt in my mind, but those women that go through this stuff are now, like, because people are questioning her and whether it happened or not, real victims are now going, well, no one's going to believe me because this one's out in the open and nobody believes her.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So my problem is that the media, I have a problem with the way the media handled this because they use this to attack the current government. Now, of course, there's many reasons that someone might want to be critical of the current federal government. But the point was that Brittany Higgins was treated, in my view, quite appropriately. She was asked whether she wanted to go to the police, and she said no.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
As anyone with a brain knows, that the sooner you go, the more easy it is to acquire evidence.
That's right. And in the case of whether it's a sexual assault or otherwise, yes, exactly. The more quickly the police can respond, the better. And particularly in that case, there's physical evidence which is going to be gone within a relatively short period of time.
And I mean, she said it, I just want to finish this point, Natalie. She said that she felt under pressure that this would harm her career. But the fact was, how, you know, I can't comment on that. But the thing is, she must have known at least that she would not be able to get the police to take action without evidence, as anyone with the mind knows. And the fact that they somehow made this involve the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister had anything to do with this, when this is either an office disciplinary matter handled by Human Resources or a police matter. But they use this to attack the Prime Minister, who I thought is not someone who meddles in these sorts of things. Which
has made it all look very political. Now, we're actually rapidly approaching the hard time deadline we have. So Carl has asked a question, which I'll follow up with Carl on that one outside the video. We unfortunately really need to wrap up because we're now rapidly heading towards the 48-minute threshold. So thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everybody, for watching. That concludes our State of the Commonwealth series. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.